What I'm going to do here is talk about a lot of this using a bit of, well, there's an extensive body of discussion of both what artificial intelligence is, machine learning, and the related ethics involved. This body of literature is called science fiction. I've been reading it for about 60 years because nerd, but there's a lot to be gained from it. Here you see, for example, a picture of a guy who responds robotically frequently, and in fact has no innate sense of social convention or social skills. And also we have a guy who plays a character with those characteristics. And that's Bernard there from HBO's Westworld, which is actually a pretty good essay on actual artificial intelligence versus machine learning. I'm a Bernard. I'm also a Miranda, but that's a different HBO show. And the deal is on this show, Dolores there, who actually achieves full consciousness, well, we still don't know what that means. And to repeat the point, no one really knows what self-awareness is, what consciousness is, yet those are necessary concepts in the discussions of what it means to be a human or to be a person or to have full, what we call human rights. There's a TV show called Humans, which actually explores directly what are the rights of robots which become conscious, but that's a different story. For those people who are fans of the show or people who aren't familiar with it, I do want to remind people that Dolores is far more than a Roomba with guns. Again, that's very funny if you love the show. You'll be glad to know that I know I'm not as funny as I think I am. Spoiler alert, you can see on the slide there that the Roomba vacuum cleaner is made by a company called iRobot. But forgetting about the whole idea of actual artificial intelligence or consciousness or self-awareness, in the here and now, there's something called machine learning, which can approximate the effects of actual intelligence. In machine learning, well, we actually have software which can learn from experience. It can learn because people train it. People train it with all our biases and prejudices and sometimes good or bad decisions. For example, if you use Gmail, and if you actually mark things, report them as spam, you're actually training Gmail to recognize that certain kinds of email which feel like spam are spam and you really don't want to see them. I use the Google keyboard on my phone, for example, and I'm training it to recognize the expressions that I use. Gmail, both in the app and on the server side, it actually learns how you phrase things, what you're about to say. For me, it's a great convenience, but for more people, at least people who write blogs, it's frightening. All those things are accurate ways of looking at all this. Facial recognition is another area, because the ethnicity of different faces, the emotions shown by people with different faces, those are all things which are trained by people with all their biases and prejudices. Machine learning, though, can be used in autonomous weapon systems. It's possible that we could have problems like this guy. Here we have a system which really can't learn. It knows what it wants to do, and it does pose a lot of ethical issues for people who are developing this stuff. Because 50 or 60 years ago, people in the business of working with computers, including myself, were reading a whole bunch of novels and short stories by this guy, Isaac Asimov. And he was talking about robots, autonomous systems, not being able to kill people except under specific conditions. The theme of all these novels were that these ethical rules had enough play in them for disaster or conceivably for the magical development of artificial intelligence. The spoiler alert, again, is that the Roomba, made by a company called iRobot, these are from the series of short stories and novels collectively referred to as iRobot. The deal is that science fiction has influenced a great deal of the reality we're dealing with right now. Not only the internet and so-called cyberspace, but the way robots are evolving. A lot of that is based on science fiction in a good way, because the people doing this stuff have been told about the whole idea of ethical rules, and well, we're aware of them, but sometimes we need to be reminded of them so we don't build things like this guy from Black Mirror. This is Metalhead, which is a robot and a relentless killing machine, much like the Terminator. It reminds us that bad actors can weaponize machine learning, and just like Dana was speaking this morning, if your view of reality is shaped by bad actors, people or automated systems, if they shape your view of reality, you can make mistakes like invading the wrong country. Machine learning can, in fact, weaponize news feeds in a bad way or good way in large scale, so that people often, our views of reality will be shared, for better or for worse, by machine learning-based feeds. That's good or bad, but you know, if that applies to all of us at some point, all of us as individuals might be in this situation where we might accidentally invade the wrong country. So on that cheerful note, here's Tim.
Thanks, Greg. So my name is Tim Hwang. Very excited to be here as part of KMF. And what I want to do over the next few minutes is talk a little bit about the role of sort of the media in shaping the future of AI. So it's easy to kind of get confused by all the terms that are flying around, right? What exactly is AI? What exactly is machine learning? And I think Craig's remarks are great because they kind of focus on the point that the sort of popular culture around AI is actually a really important part of it, right? And at least to me, this is how I define AI, which is that it is this kind of broad category, this sort of multi-decade dream of creating sort of intelligent machines, right? Maybe not even decades, right? I think there's a good argument that it has been with us for a very long time. And part of the tricky thing about reporting on AI or thinking about AI or figuring out what our policies around AI should be is that there's this kind of smaller segment, which is the field of machine learning. And that's specifically the sort of field of computer science that's dedicated to creating algorithms that get better with more data. And what's weird is, you know, this is a little bit of a Venn diagram, actually. There are things that kind of fall into AI that use machine learning, these huge breakthroughs that have happened in the last few decades. And we recognize them as AI, right? So when AlphaGo, the system that Google's DeepMind used to win a match against the world Go champion, won, that is a case of machine learning, and it's also a case of AI. But it actually turns out that there's lots of forms of machine learning that kind of don't fit into our category or something that we wouldn't automatically recognize as AI. So when you feed a check into an ATM and it reads your handwriting and says, this is a check for $1,000, that handwriting recognition actually leverages machine learning. So you're probably saying, OK, this is fun but kind of wonky, and why are you telling me all of these semantics? And I think the reason is that actually the public kind of soaks up these definitions, and it leads to very interesting results in how people think about where AI even is. So this is a quick visualization from a public opinion survey that our initiative funded that kind of asks a statistically representative group of Americans just a simple question, right? Which is, given this object, do you think it contains AI, that's the purple line, automation, that's the blue line, machine learning, that's the green line, or robotics, that's the red line, right? And you can see the percentages that people kind of respond to things, right? And you know, automatically there's this interesting bias that emerges. So among driverless cars and trucks and social robots that can interact with humans, the public does a great job of recognizing what that is. They say, there's AI there, it contains these things, it's probably a kind of robotics, it's kind of an AI, it probably contains this thing called machine learning we've heard about. But what's interesting is if you look at the row above, right, Google Translate, recommendations for Netflix movies or Amazon ebooks, the percentage is way lower, actually. What's interesting is that all of these technologies are currently using machine learning. And so the public only recognizes that AI is existing in some places, but not others when it's actually in both places at the same time. So why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because basically what we think about when we think about AI is everything under the street lamp, right? And we only think about the parts of machine learning that kind of peek into the light cast by this definition. And in fact, there's a lot of machine learning that just sort of exists outside of the kind of mental models that we bring to thinking about AI. So this has a couple of very real and very important implications for how the technology is developed and deployed. For one, it really influences the kinds of public opinion that companies face when they deploy the technology. So some of you may have tracked this really interesting story that happened in the past 12 months of basically a number of Google employees organizing to stop Google from providing their machine learning services, specifically computer vision, to the US military. And this is a case in which sort of an AI application was recognized, and there was activism against it, right? And companies, use that as a data point. They say, well, okay, maybe we're going to get, some bad press if we try these types of applications. But the point is that there may be lots of uses of machine learning that we don't recognize as AI that make it very difficult to rally people to take action on, perhaps not so great uses of the technology. So that's for one. Secondly, it actually also influences the kinds of policies that we might come up with as well. So some of you may have seen this tweet from Bernie Sanders. I think there's a lot of indications that point to the idea that AI will become a really big 2020 election issue. But if we're only making policies that apply to what we think of as AI versus this broader category of machine learning, we really might miss a lot of the implications or impacts of the technology. So why is this? Well, one argument is that machine learning is really wonky. It's kind of a computer science thing. There's a lot of sort of math. It can also be used in lots of different ways, right? I can use machine learning to recognize whether or not there's a cat in an image, or I can use that very same technology to determine whether or not it's a tank on the battlefield that the drone should drop a bomb on, right? And this is difficult because the technology appears in so many different places, and it's kind of shrouded in this jargon. And I think this actually points to the very important role that the media has to play in ensuring that the public's eyes are in the right place as this technology continues to develop. I think a little bit about the work of Ida Tarbell at the turn of the century investigating Standard Oil. And one of the sort of innovations or one of the accomplishments there was to say, hey, we have this big thing, Standard Oil, that is doing things in all these different places around the country, but actually all these things are linked, right? And that there is actually sort of an argument that can be made around this new kind of technological and business force that we face. And I think there's a similar need to do that today. Now, I think there's a question, which I think Julia will probably take up, which is the question of how do we investigate, right? Because I think the investigations that take place in this kind of context, at this point over 100 years ago, look very different from the types of methodologies and practices we need to bring in to investigating the AI of today. So I guess with that, I'll transition over to Julia.
Hi there. Thanks for that great queuing up. I love Ida Tarbell. She's my journalistic heroine, so I love to be compared with her in any possible way. I'm going to talk about what it's like to cover and write about artificial intelligence, and also how I use artificial intelligence in my reporting. So just a little tiny bit of background. I am a longtime tech journalist. I grew up in Palo Alto. I started coding in 5th grade. I was going to go into the computer industry, but I fell in love with journalism. Worked 14 years at the Wall Street Journal, then 4 years at ProPublica, and I have just left to found a new nonprofit called the Markup. And it's the point of the Markup, we haven't started publishing yet, so don't worry if you've never heard of us. But we are going to be investigating the human impact of emerging technologies. And the way we're going to do that is actually by using technology. So half of our newsroom is going to be coders, basically, data journalists with programming skills. And we are going to pair them with traditional journalists and do investigations that examine how technology is working and looking at the inside of these black boxes that are governing more and more of our lives. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that I did at ProPublica that is going to be a model for what we're going to do at the Markup. But we haven't done anything at the Markup, so I can't tell you anything about that yet. But we're hoping to do more of the types of work that I'm going to talk about. So one of the biggest investigations that I did at ProPublica with my team was an investigation of bias in an algorithm that is designed to predict whether criminals are likely to re-offend. And this is software that is used across the country. The investigation actually was centered on Broward County, not far from here, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And what we did was we did public records request, and we got the information about everyone who had been arrested in a 2-year period in Fort Lauderdale. And when they were booked into jail, they were asked a whole series of questions about whether they had ever been arrested before, whether anyone in their family had been arrested, whether they were living in a dangerous neighborhood, whether they had a job. And all of those things were put into an algorithm which gave them a score of how risky they were, 1 through 10. And the judges used that score when deciding whether to let them free on bail. And so we decided to investigate whether that score was A, accurate, and B, biased. And so we did 6 months of data work, and after making a long story very short, we essentially found that the score was biased against Black defendants. It was only right 60% of the time, and the 40% of the time that the score was incorrect, meaning it inaccurately predicted whether this person would go on to be arrested in the next 2 years. And the way it was wrong differently for Black and white defendants. So it was twice as likely to say a Black defendant was going to commit a crime when they actually did not go on to commit one. And it was twice as likely to underpredict for a white defendant, saying that they would not go on to commit a crime when they actually did. And so this was a bias in the error rates, which is a complicated story, and you're probably right now, your mind's going like, what the hell is she talking about? But it is actually an important finding because it's just as important to find out when an algorithm is correct as to find out when it's incorrect. And so this was an investigation that was interesting in that we didn't use artificial intelligence. We did a public records request, and then we simply sat there and matched all those 18,000 people's scores with whether they went on to commit a future crime, which meant looking up every one of their criminal records, which was a nightmare. However, it was traditional data journalism and statistical analysis that allowed us to come to this conclusion. We also, though, use AI in our investigations. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to be fast. But basically, after the Trump election in November 2016, there were a lot of questions, and there still are questions, about how much Facebook advertising played a role in his election. In particular, dark ads, Cambridge Analytica, there were a lot of rumors. So we decided to build a tool using AI to help us figure out what types of ads were running on Facebook after the election. So we built a classifier, which is a kind of AI, to determine what is a political ad. And we gave people software, so anyone could install a little bit of software on their computer, and when they went to Facebook, it would look at the ads that were on their feed and decide which ones were political, and then send them to this public database that anyone could see what political ads were out there. Because as you probably know, Facebook only shows everyone a different set of ads. So there was no public database of all the ads that were out there. So we attempted to build one using AI. What we found, actually, surprisingly, was we didn't find that many political ads that were problematic, but we did find that there was a huge amount of age discrimination going on Facebook. So strangely, while collecting those ads, we also noticed that there were all these ads that were for jobs, and they had an age limit in the targeting. So they were only shown to people who are certain ages, like 18 to 36 or 18 to 54, which is actually probably illegal. That case is in the courts right now, but it is not legal to say basically no older people can apply to your job. So we ended up finding something different than what we set out to find, but it was the AI that set us off on this path. And then, of course, we also found that Facebook was allowing advertisers to exclude people by race in their advertising system, and that advertisers were using that for things like excluding people from employment and housing ads, which is also being investigated right now. So in summary, I guess I would just say that AI is an important tool for journalists. Both, it's something that we need to investigate and hold accountable because it's automated decision making that has no due process around it, right? It's very difficult to argue if you've been assigned a score 1 through 10. How do you go to court and say, no, you said I'm a 7, I'm a 4, right? That's not something we have built into our legal system. And so it's something that we as journalists need to think about and hold accountable. And I would also say that we should try to use these tools in our favor too, because they're good, important tools for investigating the most important questions of our time. Thank you.
So thank you. I think this is a great level-setting baseline because I think when we talk about AI, we always think about what AI could do. And in fact, I'm sure many of us have got vendors or requests or even advertisement is like, AI could do this now. AI could fulfill your dreams and destinies. So I want to get a sense of what is it that AI couldn't do? What are some of the misconceptions of AI right now?
Well, I think one thing is that AI is sort of extremely limited in understanding context. So, for example, AI is quite good at if you have a task that runs along the lines of, here's a photo, is there a bird in it, or is there a cat in it, right? But it's a lot more, it's a lot worse, I would say, at doing something like, here's an image, is there extremist content inside of it? Right, and because the skills you need in order to solve that type of problem requires just a lot more context and is actually a great deal more sort of subjective and involves a lot more human judgment. And AI is kind of very far away from accomplishing those types of tasks.
I guess I would just say that AI is not even that good at photos. I'm sorry to be the party pooper here, sure. But we have so many terrible examples about AI misclassifying. So probably you may or may not have know the story about Google's automatic tagging of photos where it tried to guess what's in your photo and put a little caption. And so it didn't, it tagged a photo of black faces as gorillas. And it basically was a failure of their machine learning system that they hadn't sort of adequately trained it, right? They had trained it incorrectly, and so it learned bad things. And unfortunately, that's not an isolated experience, right? There's been the work of Joy Boilamwini at MIT Media Lab has been constantly testing all of the facial recognition software that's out in the market and showing that consistently they fail to identify black faces accurately. And this is terrifying because this is software that's actually rolling out to police departments and law enforcement right now. And so I just want to say that it's not even that good at image recognition.
Right now, machine learning is a moving target. Lots of problems, lots of advances. For example, voice recognition on my phone is now ready for prime time. Makes mistakes, but it's still useful. The idea is that if improperly used, like with facial recognition, it can result in tragedy. And if used in a half-assed way, let's say for Google Photos, it can be useful, but sometimes hilarious. For example, it confuses my pictures of American robins with pictures of hermit thrushes, which of course is tremendously hilarious. The deal is, it's a moving target, and it is right now misapplied in ways that can get people killed.
And even in this short brief, we talk about AI, there's algorithm, there's machine learning, there's voice assistant. I mean, the fundamental principle, should we even use the terminology AI in our sort of day-to-day conversation, or should we be just really narrowly focused on which branch of the technology? How do you feel about sort of this notion of like AI being thrown around?
I try not to use the word AI. I try to use automated decision making. I think it makes more sense to people, like, oh, I understand what an automated decision is. And there's all sorts of nightmarish semantic fights within the AI field about whether what you're talking about is AI or machine learning. So for instance, the the software that we wrote about that scores criminals about whether they're likely to commit a future crime is not a machine learning algorithm. And so a lot of people were like, oh, well, it's not an AI investigation. And it's like, okay, I don't really care if it's an AI investigation. It's an automated decision-making tool that's being brought into the court system. And I think it's important to write about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth talking about AI insofar as that it influences all of these decisions, and that in fact there are lots of tools being sold under the banner of AI, when largely it is sort of just a repackaging of what has sort of existed before. And so I think it's useful to challenge the use of that word and to actively be like kind of part of how that term is evolving in society.
Yeah, AI perhaps is more of a marketing term now than a fact-based term. I like Julia's terminology, maybe best of all.
And when we think about, the local communities, how should they frame the questions and issues of AI for civic leaders, for local community foundation funders? And it's, because now it's so buzzy, right? Some of them just like, oh, they are using AI to solve this community problem. Should I fund it? Should I not fund it? How should we help people even frame the question locally? Because I think most of the conversation really happened at a much higher level, at a national level. Yeah, Tim?
I mean, I think the key question there is whether or not you frame it up as technology is going to solve this social problem. Mm-hmm. And I think that framing tends to be sort of extremely dangerous just because it tends to lead to deployments of the technology that really don't take kind of the complexity of some of these problems into account. And so I guess maybe, at first assessment, I think that's one thing that really needs to change about how we frame up some of this stuff to local communities.
Yeah, I've been putting it from a different context as an ethical question, because a lot of the people involved in all this, at least on the coding or software side, are people at social media platforms who could use a reminder to treat people like they want to be treated. This applies to AI or machine learning or automated decision-making per the fiction that I alluded to earlier. And this is a big topic because right now the Center for Humane Technology is trying to get into this more. The computer sciences, the ethical challenge is trying to get into this more. That's some of the stuff that I'm funding. In this, I'm increasingly influenced by ethicists like Anand Giridharadas and also Chidi Anagonye. And only one of those is fictional, but I take both seriously. Thank you.
I guess I would say there's 3 questions I would ask about any automated decision-making system, whether you're a funder or whether you're a journalist covering it. And I think that there's 3 things I always think about. Like, 1, how does this affect human autonomy, right? What does it mean for people's autonomy in their life? If there's a system that, I think we've all gotten okay with the idea that you just automatically get a ticket if you speed in an area where they have some sensors. But are we willing to do that with going to jail? Are we willing to do that with high stakes humans' decisions? And so that's the first question. The second question I would ask about all automated tools is due process. What is the due process around it? What is your ability to dispute the findings and to examine those findings? As you may or may not know, in Europe, they've just passed the GDPR Privacy Act, which actually gives citizens the right to demand an explanation of some sort of automated decision making. We don't have that right here in the US, but we could ask for it as citizens. And then I guess finally, the other thing is I think all these tools should be tested for disparate impact, right? We have so much evidence that the few tools that have been tested, the facial recognition tools, the criminal justice tools, are biased against people of color. And I continue to find that in every examination of these tools. And so it seems like an appropriate test of any automated tool is, have you examined whether it has any bias and whether it's disparate impact?
Has there a lot of talk within the companies, the technologists, and even sort of in local government about the ethics and governance of AI, right? Because I think it's one of these, again, AI, we meet so many marketers who use that word, and I just feel bad for them because they're just reading a brochure with a 3 bullet point, and they have to come out and sell you this thing. Is there a governance structure? Is there a governing body that talk about, AI for good versus bad?
I mean, there's the Partnership for AI, which is the leading tech companies have gotten together to come up with a framework, an ethical framework for the use of AI. And correct me if I'm wrong, Cheung, I don't think they've released this framework yet, but they're working on it. So, and it's actually all the big companies. It's Apple, Google, Microsoft, IBM. So it's a good faith effort. I think there's a lot of good-hearted people trying to work on this issue, but these tools are out there now, and actually the ones that I'm most worried about are not built by those companies, right? Like this software in criminal justice system is one of 24 types of such software used in the criminal justice system throughout this country, right? Without much independent oversight. And then there are systems like this the police use for predictive policing, and there are systems like this that people use for hiring, where they scan resumes to decide who to hire. And I remember when Amazon came out recently and said, oh, oops, our hiring software discriminated against all women, right? Like that shouldn't be okay, right? And so the problem is there's enormous areas of software and automated decision-making where actually those big companies are not running those programs. And in fact, it's the smaller companies that are more likely to make those types of mistakes.
Yeah, and I think we've gone through an interesting arc, at least with the big companies on this, which is, I think, thanks largely to the credit of journalists kind of like digging into some of these issues. I think a lot of the companies are now saying, oh, you got us. Like, we're working on ethics in AI. And I think now there's a moment to try to hold them to those promises to avoid, effectively an emergence of kind of greenwashing in the space where you say, we have an ethics team, they sign off on stuff and it's all good, so you don't need to worry about it anymore.
Yeah, I kind of like the idea of quiet back-channel diplomacy, reminding people of what they kind of already know, and that seems to work. I guess we should apply it to smaller companies, because I keep thinking of a recent video from Boston Dynamics, which has a kind of robotic dog, much like Metalhead from Black Mirror. And I think 6 weeks ago, they showed it learning how to open a door. And that's terribly disturbing, because in the fictional version of Metalhead learns to get all stabby. And I really don't want a robot becoming stabby that learns how to open a door.
Wow. So I just want to leave some room for questions. So.
Good timing. Thank you. We'll go here and then here.
And please identify who you are, and I would love it if you actually have a question.
I have a question. I'm Stephen Livingston from George Washington University. First of all, I appreciate Chidi. I think he's one of the world's great underappreciated philosophers. But moving on from that, the panel has decided to sort of focus on machine learning as one of the central, most important features of artificial intelligence. But I wonder if anyone would be interested in commenting on deep learning or on reinforcement learning. Somebody mentioned a moment ago about AlphaGo, but after AlphaGo was AlphaZero, which throughout this is getting a little wonky, I know, but it threw out the machine learning and just simply used a reinforcement mechanism within the system itself. And what's startling about that is the accelerated pace of advancement in capabilities that were found when you remove the human from the element. This leads to other considerations, such as generative adversarial networks and deep fakes, generally speaking, face-to-face transplant. This has tremendous implications for journalism and for truth-telling through images. I wonder if the panel has anything to say about that. This is this phenomenon where one can take a face and digitally insert it onto another person's body, or generative adversarial networks where an entirely fictitious image is produced through deep neural networks. Again, it has tremendous implications for the future of truth-telling through what looks like photography. Does anyone have any thoughts on this?
I think I would start by saying that I think it's increasingly incumbent on journalists to consider themselves forensic researchers, right? Our job is to bring people the truth, and we need to verify that truth. We have a tradition for human sources of how we verify, but for digital sources, we don't have good standards and practices. That's one reason my newsroom is going to be half programmers, so that we can try to bring the best technology to bear on these kinds of questions.
Sure. I guess I tend to be a little bit on the other side of the deepfakes debate. So some of you may have seen these demonstrations where machine learning is used to create very believable video and audio. And I guess I tend to be skeptic about the long-term impact of it, largely because it's so cheap to spread disinformation without fancy machine learning tools, right? That you can actually just through text do a great job at spreading disinformation. And I think that a lot of the people conducting very organized campaigns of propaganda tend to be pragmatists. They want the biggest amount of disinformation for the lowest spend. And so I'm still skeptical about the long-term impact of it on the information ecosystem. But I think it's a much larger debate that we can definitely have.
I'm Lee Kiesler from the library in Charlotte. My question for the three of you is, if tomorrow someone gave you the keys to a public library system, how would you use AI to serve customers in the community better?
The next question. That was a good one.
Does that mean I don't have to learn the Dewey Decimal System?
I mean, maybe one thing just to throw it out, I'll jump in, is, so we have some cases where machine learning is used every day to great effect, right? And it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any problems. But I actually wonder whether or not things like search actually get really improved, not just for like the world's biggest search engines, but eventually for institutions that need to get information to people in all forms. And so I think there's an interesting application there.
Yeah. Aside from my imagination failing me, my gut tells me that the need and use of librarians that'll be with us indefinitely. My guess is until we get something as smart as true intelligence, librarians are going to be better than software in helping us. Well, my bias has to do with librarians helping me find science fiction to read 50 or 60 years ago.
I mean, I think one of the ways is you look at AI as a companion, right? So imagine every librarian have an AI companion that could sort of do these recommendations. So some of you are really way young, but for some of us who went to the library to do research back then, I could imagine a librarian using an AI to help find those wonky sci-fi fictions that we don't normally find from the without looking through the that catalog-y thing. Questions?
More questions?
In the back, right behind you.
Hey, I'm Georgia Coleman. I'm with Richland Library, so another librarian. And this might be a silly question, but you alluded to robots getting stabby. And I just wonder about whether you see a real existential threat from artificial intelligence.
The idea of robots, perhaps magically or through bicameral mind work, if they achieve consciousness, what are they going to do with us? Like, what if they take over the nuclear launch systems, like in Terminator and Skynet? And we don't really know, because that kind of robotic intelligence might be very different than human intelligence. They might transcend human consciousness, sublimate, as they say in science fiction, and just disappear completely. They might decide we're annoying and decide to wipe us out, or they might keep us as pets. The Ian Banks culture novels talk about that pretty well. The novels of The Matrix talk about keeping us around to be biological batteries, which is actually not viable, but interesting and scary to think about. All this means no one really knows, because no one knows what the nature of that kind of consciousness would be. It does make for some great speculation and some great science fiction and some great special effects, even if the sequels don't really work out.
I mean, I think one way of reframing these issues is that AI is actually already quite existential. Depends on who you talk to, right? At the point where you have these systems make decisions around bail or use them to determine for predictive policing, for instance. Yeah, I think the implications are quite existential already in some ways.
Tom Johnson from the New Mexico Foundation for Open Government. Oftentimes, AI or machine learning will produce a result that will show up often as a number. It might be a probability, it might be something on a scale, could even be a color. Has anybody, in terms of civic concern, had some case law where the vending agency was required to produce their complete algorithm and the sources and quality of the data that led to that final statistic or data point?
So there's a lot of interest in the algorithm itself, and I have to say I think that interest is often misguided. I'll give you 2 reasons why. One, the night before we published the Compass investigation, the company that built that software, we had sent them all of our data and our methodology. We'd spoken to them for months. And in a last-ditch effort to convince us that they didn't mean to be biased, which, by the way, we didn't accuse them of, they sent me the algorithm. They said, it's secret. You can't share it with anyone, but here's what it is. So they sent it to me. It was a linear equation, okay? And it was a bunch of inputs, multiplied by a constant plus another bunch of inputs multiplied by a constant. And I have a math degree. The programmers I work with are smart. I defy you to look at that algorithm and say, the output is likely to be biased in the error rates in this particular way. Like that isn't, the only way you would ever get to that analysis is by actually running stuff through the algorithm and seeing what the outputs look like. So I think that like the focus on the transparency of the algorithm itself can be misguided. I'll tell you another story. At ProPublica, we wrote a story about the New York City Crime Lab had decided to build its own DNA matching algorithm. Although there were many out there, including the FBI's, which is the best in class, they were like, we also would like to build an algorithm so we can match the DNA we find on the gun with the DNA of a person that we suspect. So they built their own secret algorithm. No one ever saw it. And it was used for almost a decade, and about 10,000 people were convicted based on it. And it was challenged in court, and a computer scientist came in and looked at the algorithm, and he said, this thing has errors in the code. So the court sealed the algorithm, but the city quietly retired it and put in a new algorithm that was more accepted and better known. We FOIA'd ProPublica, we did a public records request for that sealed algorithm at the court, and we got it unsealed. We published it. We published the whole thing. And nobody has actually done that, and we called for people to analyze it. And the truth is, it's really hard to analyze. I've spoken to a lot, you have to be a DNA expert and a C# programming expert, and you would need some training data to run through it to see the outputs. And so there hasn't been much outcome from it, although it's sitting on the ProPublica website right now, and you're welcome to look at it. And so I think like the algorithms themselves don't reveal, it's the outputs that reveal the truth. And so I think we have to focus on analyzing those outputs.
Tim, do you have something to add? Or you just...
Oh, no, just it's a great case, so just take a note.
So final questions, AI, opportunity or a problem? Why?
Both, because it can be used to improve our lives, but it could also result in, and has resulted in, tragedy.
I mean, I guess my spin on it would be like sort of in reaching for the opportunity too early, we may actually run into a lot of the problems of the technology, right? That the kind of promise of AI is so great in some ways that we sort of rush into the deployment of these technologies before really kind of thinking about what they're doing. And so, I guess in some ways the sort of opportunity is getting in a way of actually kind of like realizing the opportunity.
Yes, I mean, I'm going to echo all of you, but I guess I feel like AI is no different than the rest of tech, and tech is really, it's a tool. And what humans do with tools is they use them both to grow food and as weapons. And so I feel like my job is to mitigate the harm and notice the parts where technology is used as a weapon and try to make sure we shine a light on that. And I think that, but to see it as anything other than a tool that can be used for good and bad is probably just to simplify the situation.
Great. With that, we want to thank you for your insight.
Thank you all.